Hi, welcome back. This video is going to be on Joshua and the Conquest, and I'm going to be looking at a little bit of Chapter 5's PowerPoint. Hopefully you would have read that chapter by now. So let's take a look at that first, and then we'll try to squeeze into Joshua. Okay, so here we go, Chapter 5. This is basically describing what's called the Deuteronomistic history, which describes the rise and fall of the nation state of Israel. So far, in terms of your background in history, you've gone through the primeval history where Genesis 1 through 11, where it's unclear whether those things really happen. Then chapters 12 through 50 of Genesis were the four patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. At the end of Genesis, there was a drought, as I had mentioned, and the people of Israel actually went down into Egypt because there was a drought in Canaan, and then they got trapped there because the Egyptians enslaved them. Cut to 350 years later, in the year 1250, Moses is a descendant of one of those 12 tribes that went in there, or 12 brothers that went in there, specifically Joseph's brothers, Levi. And he is raised as an Egyptian, but comes to his calling through the burning bush to basically lead the Hebrew slaves that are trapped in Egypt back to Canaan, the promised land. So he does that, and in the process spends 40 years in the wilderness, getting all those laws together, and dying shortly before he gets to enter the promised land. And that event was called the Exodus, the leaving of Egypt out of slavery towards the promised land. Okay, so Moses is dead. We're looking at the year 1200 because he leaves Egypt around 1250 BCE. They spent 40 years in the wilderness. Now they're on the brink of Canaan to return to the promised land, and it's roughly around 1200 BCE. Joshua, who's also from the tribe of Levi, is now leading the people of Israel into Canaan, which is occupied by all these Canaanites, which they then have to defeat. Okay, so the history then describes Joshua, the conquest, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, and then the prophets. So it's basically describing the rise and fall, the entry into Canaan, developing it into a monarchy, calling it Israel, and then dividing it in half, and then its takeover by various empires. So it's like the rise and fall of Israel. Okay? So in terms of Canaan, in the land, which is kind of like the geographical designation, there's two different versions of that conquest. One of them is in the book of Joshua, chapters 1 through 12, and that is the one the Bible would like for you to believe, where God is this miracle worker, and they all go in there, and with a blast of their horns, Jericho falls, and it's really all about faith in God that leads to, success in the battlefield. And then there's the version in Judges, the book of Judges 1 to 2, where really it was kind of like a slow infiltration of the Hebrews into Canaan and gradually taking it from the inside. In Joshua, Israel's led by Joshua, strict obedience to God. He's kind of like a mini Moses, conquers Canaan, basically God doing all the work in the form of a divine warrior. And it's really success happens when you obey the covenant and follow God's laws. Judges is the same, but instead of a huge army in Joshua, smaller tribes slowly over time, over hundreds of years, take over smaller pieces of land until they finally establish a tribal confederacy, which is a loose confederacy or organized group of tribes, the 12 tribes, that basically govern individual tribal areas with a judge, which is kind of like a mini king. The judge rules over the particular tribe. So that's a confederacy, much like the Southern Confederacy during the Civil War. So, because we have two historical descriptions of how the conquest happens, many people had different theories about it, which are these theories, right? How did the Israelites occupy Canaan? I'll let you read the chapter in terms of the three different kinds of theories that were suggested. And what the author, Howard, suggests is that The Exodus group was inherently small to begin with. Joshua led the Exodus group into the lands of Canaan, west of Jordan. Some settled on unoccupied lands. Some tried to integrate themselves with the native Canaanites. They never actually dominated the Canaanites. They just kind of melded in with the Canaanites, and periodically different stories appeared about various judges of the various tribes. So I think what the author is saying, and actually many theorists just say they kind of went in, they settled, they didn't take over, they just kind of existed until the need to take over and make a monarchy happened, which was during the time of David. Okay, so let's take a look at then the story of Joshua, right? That's the setting. So think 1200 BCE, Moses is dead, Joshua has survived the wilderness period, and he is now entering Canaan as the new leader, right? So after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, my servant is dead, now you're going to go across the Jordan. And so this is a good time to look at a map. Cross the Jordan into Canaan, and basically everything that I promised Moses, I am promising to you, because you are now my kind of right-hand man, right? So be strong, courageous, do not be frightened or dismayed. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So remember, if you obey the commandments of God, you will get the promised land, many descendants, and God will be by your side. And this conquest that's described in Joshua 1 through 12 is every bit that God is on your side. All right? So the second chapter is actually a charming story about how they sent in spies into Jericho, one of the Canaanite cities, to see how it was. And Rahab, who was a prostitute who ran a house of ill repute, it's interesting that they go there first, right? She basically realizes, because she hears, what's happening, that she's going to put her bets on the Israelites and not on the indigenous Canaanites, and she essentially saves them. And makes a bargain that says, hey, when you come into Jericho and take over the city, you're going to spare me. And one of the interesting things is they're going to cross over Jordan, a large body of water, and when they do, the water splits into two, much like the Red Sea split into two when Moses escaped into the Sinai with the Hebrews. In this case, she says, I don't want you to kill me when you come in, so I'm going to hang a red scarf outside my window, and then when you come in to conquer Canaan, you will see that red thing around my window, and you will pass me over. You will pass over my house. So it's very similar to when the lamb's blood saved all the Hebrews, firstborn, from being killed by God because they put a red mark on their door. Here, Rahab is going to put a red scarf on her window in order for them to pass over her house. So there are strong parallels between the conquest of Canaan and the Exodus event, because they're trying to make Joshua kind of like Moses, okay? So she saves them and kind of, lies about where they are. And then they come in and essentially crosses the Jordan, where it's kind of like crossing the Red Sea, carrying what's called the Ark of the Covenant into Canaan. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is actually a large box. Let me just show you. I'll show you a picture of it. This is what it looks like, right? And inside this Ark of the Covenant is actually the two tablets that hold the Ten Commandments. So symbolically, wherever this Ark of the Covenant goes, so it's an Ark of the Covenant, which is inside, wherever this goes is really where God goes. And this area right up here is called the mercy seat, where God is supposed to be sitting as you carry this ark or box around. You notice that there are two wooden poles because you are not allowed to touch the seat of God. This is holy, and you're not allowed to access it at all. So he brings the Ark of the Covenant over. They cross over the Jordan and set up a little commemorative stone thing at Gilgal. Then they do a mass circumcision, which is the sign of the covenant with God, similar to when Moses brought the Hebrews into the Sinai. They did a mass circumcision there of everyone in order to be, God's people. Here they do the same thing. So that's another parallel. Just imagine the mass circumcision, right? And then in 6, they take over Jericho just by blowing horns, and the walls go flat, because as Joshua would like for you to believe, God does all the work for those who are faithful. So it's almost as if they didn't even have to pick up a weapon, because God did everything as a divine warrior. So they do. They blow the trumpet and the walls come flat. And then the victorious story of Jericho is counteracted with the sin of Achan, where in chapter 7, amongst the many spoils of war which only belong to God, and that's called a harem, from Jericho, Achan, one of the citizens, took something, a very beautiful blanket from Shinar, and by taking that, you are disrespecting God. If God is doing all the work as a divine warrior and you're just blowing your horn, everything from that battle belongs to God. And if you take something, you are breaking the covenant. So remember, even though God wants to give you promised land, many descendants, and be your God forever, this is a conditional God. You have to obey all of his commandments and you will get these things. If you don't, like steal from the spoils of war, it's going to be really bad. So when they try to go and attack Ai, which is a small city, they're not successful, because if God is not on your side, you will not succeed, even an unfortified city like Ai. So it ends up that they actually have to kill Achan and all of his descendants, and then God will be pleased again, and then God will allow you to take the city. So that's what Joshua is trying to communicate, is only God, if you have God on your side, are you going to be successful. So a giant fortified city like Jericho, all you have to do is blow a horn and it's yours, because God is on your side. A tiny unfortified city like Ai, if you take one thing from the spoils of war, God will not let you take over that city unless you make it right, which they do. So they take over the city, and then they have essentially the rest of these stories, as you filter through Joshua, are other additional cities and territories that, with the help of God, Joshua and the Israelites managed to encroach and come in and then establish that tribal confederacy. Okay? If you go over to Judges, oopsie, you will notice that after the death of Joshua, Israelites are still hanging out with a bunch of Canaanites. So this is what I was telling you about, how Joshua is trying to suggest that they just went in, God did all the work, cities fell, bang, bang, bang. They got the city, they got the tribal confederacy, they instituted themselves, and everything was great. And then you go to the beginning of Judges 1, and they're saying, actually, no, you weren't successful in taking over everything. So have a look at Judges 1 and 2 just to see the description of the fact that they were living side by side with these Canaanites for several hundred years. And I also assigned a couple of stories in Judges, I think 3, 4 to 5, and 13 to 15, maybe not 13 to 15, but 3 and 4 to 5, just to give you a sense of like the types of stories that Judges had, where as they're fighting these Canaanite neighbors, over the course of 300 years, certain events and skirmishes happened, and those were just some of the examples of various tribes fighting against various Canaanite neighbors. And some of them are actually quite entertaining, so I would take a look. Eventually, they do establish the tribal confederacy and manage to be the main game in town in terms of Canaan, until the very end of the book of Judges, at which point the Philistines come in. You should be familiar with that, because you already read the chapter that describes the history of Israel and how the Philistines around 1050 came in and were such a major threat that it took consolidating into a monarchy and electing a king, David, in order to vanquish the Philistines once and for all. And that will be next.